Right. Hopefully you're already in Luke chapter 8. Nobody knows for sure whether Luke was an actual physician. He's called that by Paul. He's referred that way. If he was some type of actual physician, the way we think of it, this story would have been ringing in his ears. You know, in a time like this, without modern medicine, without government-funded health care, without private insurance companies, good health was an extremely precious thing. It's a really, really important thing now. Way more important in a time like this. And usually if you didn't have it, poverty kind of followed closely behind it. Just to remind you where we are in the study of Luke, several weeks ago we looked at one of the first parables that Luke records, and he places it at the beginning of the parables. We will, beginning in June, we will go through some 20 parables on Sunday mornings. Jesus taught a lot this way. It was very, very common in the first century, in the Second Temple period. And Luke opens up his version of these parables with the parable of the soils. It's often referred to as the sower and the seed. It has very little to do with the sower or the seed as far as what Jesus spends his time on. It has very much to do with the soil of the soul. We're about one letter switching, and we've got the same thing. It's really a condition of the heart. It has nothing to do, as we talked about a few weeks ago, about whether or not you are a follower of Jesus or not a follower of Jesus. It just simply has to do with where your soil is at, the receptivity we have to God and His influence on us. At any moment, quite frankly, we can be like the dirt that's trampled hard and receives nothing. We can be like the dirt that receives quickly in an emotional way, but then quickly lets it get choked out. Or we can be like the one soil that he really emphasizes, the good soil. And then what Luke does for you and I is he records a series of miracles that take place immediately after the soils parable, really because it's the explanation, quite frankly. We looked at Jesus getting in the boat and the storm coming and where the disciples' soil was at. We looked at Jesus getting to the other side, if you will, heading the corner of the Sea of Galilee and going into Gerasene territory, going into Gentile territory, where this guy who was full of demons receives Jesus. His soil is fantastic. We also see how the Gentiles then drove Jesus out of their territory because they were very uncomfortable with him and the pig population was dropping too rapidly. And so we see what their soil is like. And this morning we will see the culmination of that in a series of two stories that both the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Luke place within one another. It's a little like if you try to pull a weed that's on a plant and you pull the weed up and the plant comes with it. It's really almost impossible to teach one of these miracle stories without teaching the other. And Luke does not intend them to be pulled apart like the Gospel of Mark does not either. The stories are fascinating together. They rely on each other. One looks like a massive, just of epic proportions interruption, and yet it's what the whole story turns on. And so let's look again at our passage in Luke chapter 8, verse 40. As Jesus returned, meaning he's coming back from Gentile territory, the people welcomed him, for they had all been waiting for him. So again, you get this idea of the soils. They're very excited to see him. They're ready for him to come back. There's this assumption that they want what Jesus has. And again, the soils scream in this. Let's read on verse 41. And there came a man named Jairus, and he was an official of the synagogue, and he fell at Jesus' feet and began to implore him to come to his house. For he had an only daughter, about 12 years old, and she was dying. But as he went, the crowds were pressing against him. It's a real blatant contrast from where we just left off last week. You know, last week we left off with this demonic guy who gets healed from it, who then Jesus commissions to go share the gospel, but they're very, very not open to this. And they literally tell Jesus, we want you to get back in your boat and leave. It's funny, I'm not so sure the disciples were that quick to want to they must have been torn. They got in the boat, they wanted to be in the boat, then the boat storms, and they want out of the boat. Now they're probably like, I want to get back in the boat. It's just, they don't know what to think. So Jesus gets out, so they shush him out. And Jesus' own people are waiting for him on the shore, seemingly welcoming him back. We'll find out very quickly that their seeming welcome is not so welcome after all. And Jesus is returning having been made very, very ritually impure. He's been in the tombs. He's been around pigs. He's been around Gentiles. He's been messing with demons. Any one of these would make you impure. All of them make you almost polluted ritually. And yet, there's no mention of Jesus doing anything to rid this, which is, I still can't get my mind wrapped around this. Maybe you can help me with this someday, Kimberly. There's so much about Jesus becoming impure in these passages, but you see very little of Jesus doing anything about it in his custom. It's really strange. I still don't know quite what to make of it. And Jesus now, having been made ritually impure by all these things, is now greeted by the very guy who's responsible in his community for ritual purity. Isn't that fascinating? And yet, this guy cares nothing of that. He cares nothing of that. It's interesting, too, to me, after seeing already how frustrated Jesus is with the Jewish leaders, you would think Jesus would be finished with guys like Jairus. He's a synagogue official. He represents this Jewish leadership that Jesus has spoken against so harshly. At this point in time, you almost would think, if you're not reading ahead and just thinking with your own soul, he must be done with this guy. And yet, he's not. And Jesus is one of those dudes that every time you think you have him figured out, you absolutely don't. And we should remember this. Every time we think we're ready to predict this Jesus, he's not necessarily predictable. And you would think Jairus, quite frankly, as a religious leader, would be done with Jesus, as many of his other cohorts were. But he's not. He cares very little about his standing. This guy is one of the main guys in his community. He doesn't care a lick about where he stands in his community. He is needy. He is broken. And he knows Jesus has an answer to what he needs. That's all he can see, and that's all he seems to care about. And he's the one who should be concerned with Jesus' purity, falls before Jesus, asking for help. As a side note, this is one of those male-female pairings that Luke does so often through his gospel to again emphasize that to him, men and women are equal, and they're created equal. And so again, you have the Jairus story and the hemorrhaging woman side by side. It's a literary way of making a strong point. His daughter, Jairus' daughter, is 12. To you and I, this sounds like a young kid, doesn't it? This is a junior higher, as Sean just said. So we think kid. They don't. That she is right at the age of puberty. She's right at the age of about 14 where you begin to be betrothed. Most scholars believe Mary, who had Jesus, was around 14 years old. So she is almost finished with her childhood. She's ready to start, if you will, her entire adult life. So when you see 12, don't think child, think becoming adult. And that's exactly who she is. And yet, she's dying. And by the way, more and more we will see Jesus not in the synagogues. We'll see him with people out in the open and in their homes. And then this statement where it says, but as he went, the crowds were pressing him. His only daughter is dying. And now the crowds threaten to redirect Jesus' attention away. And now, on top of that, this woman has interrupted the whole thing. Jairus has a problem that is bigger than any problem he's ever had in his life. His only daughter is dying. And his solution stands right in front of him. Everything is moving forward, and now everything sounds like it's being redirected. The crowds are redirecting him, and now this woman stands to redirect him. The plant risks being choked. Do you see the soils in this? In fact, it's fascinating. This word to press against, where it says the crowds are pressing against him, it literally means to strangle or to choke. It's only used 2 times in the New Testament. Here, and guess where else? The parable of the soils. Isn't that fascinating? Luke is making sure we do not miss the point with the language. The plant grows and yet the worries of the world choke it out. And now Jairus, who has faith in Jesus, who bows before Jesus, even in his impure moment, if you will, in his need, says, Jesus, you're the one, the only one that can help raise my daughter. And his solution is moving forward, and now it stands to be interrupted. The soil looks like it's not going to behave properly. The storm has arrived. Let's look at verse 43. And a woman who had a hemorrhage for 12 years and could not be healed by anyone came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak. And immediately her hemorrhage stopped. No words, by the way, are recorded between Jairus and Jesus. He makes the request of Jesus, and it just says Jesus goes. There's no words being recorded now. Jairus is completely silent. And we find later on in the story that proximity-wise, they are very close to Jairus' house. And so, again, you're supposed to have this feeling that Jairus' solution is imminent. It's there. He can feel it. He's got a plan, and it's working. And now it stands to be completely thrown off kilter. The solution so close is fading from him. You can feel his fingers just fade or lose their grip. A bit about this woman. First of all, it says she's from Palestine. So we already know she's just below the watermark socially. It also says she's sick. And even though she's able to get around, this is socially devastating. It also says that she has a hemorrhage. Most believe this is some form of uterine bleeding. And though it's not contagious, probably, most scholars don't think, it would still have rendered her unclean. And so she's now also removed from her community because she has a ritual uncleanness. And she can't get ritually purified because she keeps bleeding. And so the problem is, even if she gets purified by the priest, the second she walks away from the priest, the uterine bleeding keeps happening. And so she's continually removed from the community. And it also says she had gone to many doctors. So she was probably a woman of means at one point who had paid all these physicians over and over. And more than likely, she's probably at a point of being broke. It's one thing, and I've experienced this, it's one thing to be broke, like that's all you've ever been. And I know there are people here this morning that I was broke yesterday, I'm broke today, or just month to month, that's all I've ever known, month to month. It's quite another thing if you've been broke and then gotten a bunch of money and then not had it. And I'm sure there's somebody in here who's actually had money and lost it. That's way harder. Because you actually know a difference. Does that make sense? It's like having cable TV and the cable goes out. Now you're getting the rabbit ears again. You're like, yeah, that ain't cut it. If you've only had rabbit ears, they're not bad. There's a sign of age right there. And this whole 12 and 12 thing is fascinating. She has literally suffered the entire lifespan of Jairus' daughter. The entire lifespan of this girl. She's very much like the Gentile that lived in garrison territory. She is removed, though, from her community. This woman stands now alone in her isolation. If you don't feel that this morning, this passage will make no sense. She's isolated. She's in a crowd that is pressing so hard, it is strangling Jesus, the verse says. And yet, in the midst of all those people, she is isolated. Her physical need drives her to Jesus. But Jesus actually doesn't leave her there, despite the fact that she thinks she now has what she wanted. Isn't it fascinating? Jesus senses in this moment somehow that what this woman needs is beyond what physically she thinks she needs. This whole idea of touching, 4 times between verses 44 and 47, the word to touch is used. Touching is really important in both cases for Jairus and the hemorrhaging woman. Remember, soap wasn't invented until the Middle Ages. So ritual purity was huge. These taboo purity laws were huge. And between the Torah and their interpretations of it, they've codified purity for a really, really good reason. Two of the most significant sources of pollution, if you will, or ritual impurity, were corpses and internal bleeding. Anybody in the first century coming across these two stories, anybody in the first century hearing this double story would know immediately the problem that Jesus has in his hands. Because he is actually voluntarily going to touch a corpse, which is already making you impure. Now the woman touches him, making him impure, and even though he doesn't do this on purpose, it's irrelevant. If you're impure, you're impure, and you would have to go back to the priest and resolve this. So anybody reading this knows that Jesus is encountering a double problem on his hands. And yet this woman doesn't care. Isn't it fascinating that the very guy that Jairus bows before, this pure community leader bows before, this impure woman just grabs. Isn't that fascinating? She cares very little about social norms at this point. Why? Because she's so broken and needy. She is all past being polite in this sense, though she is clearly being secretive. Look at verse 45. And Jesus said, "Who is the one who touched me?" And while they were all denying it, Peter said, "Master, the people are crowding and pressing in on you." But Jesus said, "Someone did touch me, for I was aware that power had gone out of me." There's a thing we see or hear all the time, isn't it? Why does this unclean, disgraceful woman, if you will, in her society, presume to touch one that even the synagogue ruler wouldn't touch? And now the woman's real test starts. The crowds are choking, they're strangling, they're pressing in, risking the faith that she has. Jairus, who is of more importance than her on the scale, and whose issue is more important than hers visibly, because if she has uterine bleeding, she's had this for 12 years. She's not dying. She's just got a major problem on her hands. His problem is more important than hers, and he is more important than hers socially. So now she has a second problem on her hands, and it's Jairus. Peter wants the whole thing to go away, so now Peter becomes a problem for her because he wants Jesus to just move on. And fascinatingly enough, if you think about the soils, the way he refers to Jesus is simply master. We hear master and we think, wow, that's impressive. This word, this Greek word epistates, it is not the word for the Lord. You are in charge of me. This is a lower form of that word. And Peter is simply referring to him as another teacher. You teacher, let's move on. How could you possibly think that? So this woman now has the crowds working against her. She has Jairus working against her. She has Peter working against her. And on top of that, everybody else is now leaving her out to hang and denying it, including her. So again, why now does she initially hide? What causes this woman to simply sneak in and touch him from behind? You can tell she is so afraid, isn't she? She's in what I will call protection mode. And I'm going to go so far this morning to argue that I think she has been isolated so long, I think this woman actually has grown to need her isolation. Does that make sense? She has been pushed from her community for so long. It is now, unfortunately, what this woman is familiar with. Look at verse 47. Look what it says. When the woman saw that she had not... What does it say? Say it again. Gone unnoticed. Anybody have a different translation? Escaped notice. What did you say? Was not hidden. The Greek word literally means to lie hidden. Isn't that fascinating? She's in a crowd of people, so many people, that the Greek word is, it's strangling Jesus why on earth would this woman, then, would the description of this woman be that her attempt is to lie hidden, even though she is pushing through people? Isn't that fascinating? Pushing through the stranglehold on Jesus to touch him from behind, and yet she's trying to escape notice. And it says right after that she came trembling. That's not strong enough. She is terrified. This woman is completely in the prison of her own isolation. But the problem is, it's all she knows, and she wants to keep the cloak on. Does that make sense? Her isolation, in a sense, has become a security blanket for her. I see this all the time with folks. Here's a question to ask you, and I want your hand to go up. And there's no shame in this because it's just reality. How many of you grew up as children of alcoholics? Raise your hand so people can see they're not alone. And I think there's more of you, quite frankly. I see this a lot with children of alcoholics. The home is so frightening. The pain is so intense that what kids do, as we know or have seen, they go into isolation mode. They often take on a role so that they're protected. It's what they need to do to survive. Between the yelling, the violence, the stuff between the parent and the kid, the stuff between the parent and the parents. If they're both alcoholics or if one is, it dominates the home. And kids, and they have to survive. They cover themselves in a way, they play a role, if you will, to stay in isolation to protect themselves. And then, and not just children of alcoholics, we do this all the time. Maybe you've gone through intense pain through growing up. Maybe you've gone through intense pain in a relationship. The answer is, I'm never going to get that close to somebody again because nobody will ever hurt me like that again. I loved and hated what Brennan Manning once said in one of his books. He said, he was an alcoholic, actually, and he said when he came to a sense of himself, it broke him. And he said, having been broken once, my commitment was I would never be broken again. Isn't that fascinating? His life commitment at that point was, I will never feel this severity of pain, so I will isolate my soul. I will isolate my heart. That's where she's at. But it's fascinating. When someone once said, pain is God's megaphone, quite often, to wake a sleeping soul. This is how we operate in life. This is how I see people operate in life, and I've operated this way myself. A lot of us, our goal is to make sure the pain line is just low enough where I can breathe through my nostrils. I've watched marriages do this all the time. I'll counsel couples and they'll say, okay, we're finally at the point where we really need help, and Doug, you're not wise enough, we're going to go to a counselor. So they go to the counselor, and they go to the counselor just long enough so that the watermark gets right here, and then the marriage is somewhat functional, and they can breathe through their nostrils, and they go, okay, God, I'm done with that. Right? Or we do this individually. I'll work this to a point where I can handle the pain load, but I'm used to that level of pain, so then that is tolerable for me. It's insanity if you think about it. Why am I tolerating pain that is at this level? I should be painless if I'm getting the healing from Jesus. I should lean into this more heavily. But we don't do that because the isolation from other community, the isolation from relationships is, quite frankly, even though we hate it, it's comfortable. Here's a word, it's familiar. I think a lot of us stick with what we're familiar with, even though it's painful and dysfunctional, because it's the pain we know rather than the pain we don't know. This is the one thing God can't tolerate. God has no use for isolation. Now think about this. The core aspect of who God is, He's a Trinity. He's a triune God. Father, Son, and Spirit. God's essence is staying in perfect connection with Himself. Does that make sense? God doesn't even get isolation from a relational standpoint. He gets it because He's been watching you and I for so long. But He doesn't get it within Himself. And we're made literally in the essence of God's character, which means isolation is the most foreign thing to our character. And yet it's what often many of us cling to because of the pain we've had, because of the backgrounds we've got, because of the hurts we've received. We get pounded so much by relationships, we say, okay, I'm all done with that. I'm not getting close to people anymore. And it's the one thing that we're created to not be. It causes us to buy into non-reality. I've heard Jeff Clitmus say this so many times. Jeff Clitmus he has a definition for fear. His definition for fear is false evidence appearing real. Isn't that great? False evidence appearing real. We have to violently, aggressively lean in to Jesus in these times. We have to violently and aggressively lean in to one another so that Jesus can come through one another. We have to, and I hate to tell you this, risk getting hurt again, or you have nothing. Amen? Amen? Boy, you don't sound like you believe that. That sounded like a church committed to isolation to me, quite frankly. Will this woman choose safety through her isolation? Will she give in to her fear to protect herself at the cost of real healing and inner peace? Will she, on the other side, move forward in faith, even though it's scaring her to death? We do this in all kinds of ways. I watch this in all kinds of ways. People ask us questions and we say things like, here's one, I don't know. That's an isolation answer. That answer really translated means go away. And some of us, by the way, when we're asked, what are you feeling? Where are you at? Some of us don't know. But that's not an answer to accept in your life. If you don't know, that's when you press in. It's interesting. I played a role in my family. We all play roles in our family because all of our families, no matter how healthy they are, have dysfunction in them. My role as the youngest, I was the peacekeeper. I was all the way till about 30 years old. I could have taught seminars on being an approval addict. I needed people to like me. I couldn't handle one person giving me a cross look. And my life imploded when I was 30. And I was just needing this so much. To give you an idea of some of the craziness that an approval addict will do, my wife would point this out to me and I just would still just push it out. People would call me and then I would avoid returning their call because I was afraid that the conversation might go south on me and then I would feel rejected. So I would not call them back and make them mad. I mean, think about that. It's just insanity. And then I would, of course, have to call, or I would eventually see them, and they'd say, why didn't you call me back? And then now I'm really scared. There was nothing even going on. It's a false sense of reality. I'm so gripped with fear, I'm going to protect myself. I would have a conversation that would go 2 hours, and it would be great, and then I would say goodbye, and if their goodbye wasn't quite normal, whatever that is, I would walk away thinking, well, what if I said something wrong? Anybody ever experienced any of these things? It causes you to want to isolate yourself. This is not the essence of a triune God. Look at verse 47. And the woman saw that she had not escaped notice, and she came trembling and fell down before him, and declared in the presence of all the people the reason why she had touched him, and how she had been immediately healed. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Isn't it interesting? She gets healed physically, and Jesus doesn't say this. He says it after she knows she can't escape notice. He says it after she says, I don't want to be isolated anymore. I'll step out and admit it was me, and I'll come forward and risk having you reject me. He says, then your faith has made you well. Because her real healing problem was not her physical problem. Does that make sense? Her real issue was, again, her wounded heart and not feeling part of community. She must move out of what she knows. She must move out of what she is familiar with if she's going to find true healing, which she does. Look at verse 49. While he was still speaking, someone came from the house of the synagogue official saying, your daughter has died. Do not trouble the teacher anymore. But when Jesus heard this, he said to him, "Do not be afraid any longer. Only believe, and she will be made well." It's interesting, this guy's way of referring to Jesus indirectly is also teacher. It's not Kyrios. It's not the one who is in charge of me. It's simply teacher. Again, what you hear in this guy who comes to Jairus, we don't know how Jairus is thinking. But we know how the people around him are thinking. This guy to me sounds like a victim. We defined this several months ago. A victim is someone who fails to adapt today based on yesterday's expectation. You see, everything was going swimmingly for Jairus. He goes to Jesus. He bows before Jesus. Jesus has no problem. I'll come with you. They start moving towards his home, which is very close by. And then life just does a you-know-what on him. The crowds interrupt. The woman interrupts. The delay has caused this, is what we would say. The circumstance, the situation, life has caused this. This was avoidable, we would say. Where was God in this, we would say? Why did Jesus delay and screw up my solution, we would say? Isn't it fascinating, the timing of Jesus on this? In a weird way, I wonder if Jairus' faith needed this interruption. Isn't that fascinating? You see, what you and I view as the plan not working out, Jesus specializes in. Jesus' forte is taking the dung of life and touching it and making it gold. Amen? This is what Jesus does. You and I wake up and we build a plan. Right? Nothing wrong with that, to a point. And then the plan almost never works the way we had envisioned it. And then we lose it. And Jesus is saying, look for me in the interruption of your life. You will find me in the interruption of your life. Jesus shines in this. The greatest, most tragic event this world has ever seen and produced, and I'll say it that way, is the cross. There is not a more cruddy scene that has ever happened in the eternity span than the cross. It is a horrific event. It is an awful event. It is a man-created event. And yet, it is the goal of you and I who claim to be followers of Jesus, is it not? This is what Jesus does. Jesus takes the interruptions and the messiness of life and he flips them on her head. He's the Redeemer. This is what he does. And this is, I think, what Jairus needs to see. I want to close with just a couple of thoughts. Sometimes, first of all, what we really need is not what we think we need. As is with the case of the woman. We think we simply need our problem fixed. If you this morning, as we've been talking, sense that there's a part of you that isolates yourself from relationship, we do this in a lot of ways. We overwork, we overactivity, we don't return calls, we avoid personal interaction. If you're ever sensing that and doing that, there's an isolation being created. And if you sense that, I cannot implore you enough to lean in. It will feel like you're going to die. You will cling so hard to what you're familiar with, you will feel like if you let go, you won't make it. Jesus will be there. Don't live in isolation at the moment. It just sucks. It's not life. It's not what the triune God emanates. Does that make sense? Lean in to somebody. And guess what? You're gonna get hurt again. Because you are on this side of eternity. You're in a fallen, broken world that Satan rules right now. You will get hurt again. And you know what? Then Jesus will step into that interruption and create gold. I guarantee you. The second comment is this: don't be a victim. Don't sit around today complaining about what didn't work. I love Jeff Clitmus' comment. I've heard him say this many times. Boys and girls want. Men and women lean into God, and they solve problems. If you find yourself, when your day is starting to turn like Jairus' was, don't be a victim. Look to Jesus and realize this is his specialty. Let's pray. Father, these are hard thoughts. Father, nobody particularly may get a stand and cause a connection in these areas with your soul. Only you can do this. Would you move here this moment? Father, if we're living in isolation in any way, or if we're victimizing our own life, blaming life and others for things not going well, rather than leaning into you and looking for you to create pulled out of the chaos, would you move us this morning? We thank you, Jesus, that you are able to handle these issues. You are able to work with us in our infirmities. We trust you. We lean into you like Jairus in this moment. Help us with our faith. Help us with our unbelief. We pray these things in Jesus' name.